Hello and welcome to today's 18 Group webinar brought to you by Intelligent Trading Technology and Itiviti. Today's topic is MiFID II, Practical Considerations for Gainful Compliance. I'm joined today by an esteemed panel. We'll have Kerstin Wennerberg from Itiviti, Kerstin Hermansson from the Swedish Securities Dealers Association, and Pickles, who's a well-known consultant in the space. Let's move on to the first slide, please, and let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. My name is Andrew Delaney. I'm Chief Content Officer at 18 Group. I edit our Intelligent Trading Technology publication. It's an online publication, as I'm sure you're aware, and I run our Intelligent Trading Summit events, the most recent of which was just a couple of weeks ago here in London. 400 people registered and we had a very full house. And a lot of what we talked about really related to MiFID II. So I think this today's webinar is certainly pertinent, particularly in light of the fact that we started to get some solid ideas about when MiFID II might come into effect. Anyway, today what we're going to talk about is some of the key principles of the regulation and how they expect, or we expect, to them to impact data and technology practices. We'll look at impact on different asset classes. For this version of MiFID will expand the world beyond equities. And we'll be offering some guidance in terms of how to meet the technology and process requirements under the new rules. So I think it's going to be a very interesting and pertinent session today. Let's go to the next slide and let me introduce the panelists. Or let me ask the panelists to introduce themselves. Starting with you, Kerstin. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Kerstin Wennerberg, responsible for a group dealing with market structure, technology, and regulation at Itiviti. I'm based in Stockholm, and previously I worked for a Swedish bank, SEB, as CTO and head of equity trading technology.
Very good, thank you. Kerstin, tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm the managing director of the Swedish Securities Dealer Association, and of course the focus of our association, one of the focuses I should say, is MiFID, and as we say, the MiFID family. And we really are striving with our members to understand what we are going to get, what we need to comply with, to if we're relevant lobby for activities, not so much nowadays, but before. We cooperate very much in the Nordic region with the other Nordic associations for on MiFID, and I'm also chairing the European Banking Federation working group on these items. So MiFID is a key area for me.
Very good, and I'm not sure Chris is quite with us yet. He was joining us as we started, so we'll introduce Chris once he joins us. So let's get on with the discussion, and let's start with you, Krista, and let's talk a little bit about some of the key, the requirements of MiFID II that you have identified as being perhaps the most challenging.
I think. To list those challenges is the challenge itself, because the list is obviously extremely long, but on a high level I would say the legislation around non-equities in general and for bonds in particular. If we go one level more detailed, I think the requirements around algo trading, high frequency trading and market maker obligations, and also the requirements for best execution are the most challenging.
Very good. Kerstin, what do you say?
Well, I think that MiFID II includes challenges for everyone, and I actually think the biggest changes relate to commodities, not maybe much discussed in our association, but that is the changes, the regulation on commodities is part of the global regulation, you could say, so that is making a huge change, I would think, and huge challenges. However, and I also think, of course, we expected there to be challenges when it came to bond market, because we knew that was an area they wanted to regulate. But there are changes also in the equities market that are challenging, and not to forget investor protection and all these reporting requirements, they are also very challenging, especially when you go into the details. Nothing comes automatically. Everything is a challenge.
Very good. And I noticed that Chris Pickles has just joined us. Welcome, Chris.
Hiya.
Chris, we're talking about perhaps some of the more challenging aspects of MiFID II. What are you seeing in your travels? What are people flagging?
I think because I spend a lot of my time working with firms around their data and how they manage it, then to me that becomes totally fundamental. I think there's a lot of assumptions being made so far that somehow data will be there, somehow data is in the right place and in the right quantity. And more we're finding that that is a most serious challenge. So I think that taking the information as the core of our whole world today, not being able to get at the right information at the right time is, for me, the biggest challenge of all. Partly because the work needs to be done, and partly because I think many other parts of financial institutions and the regulators themselves are making fairly large assumptions about data, and they are just assumptions.
Very good, thank you. Let's move on to sort of impacting some other asset classes. Krista, MiFID I. We all have the scars on our back from MiFID I, and indeed the equity market has lived with MiFID I for 7.5 years, perhaps longer, if you were following it and preparing for it. What do we expect the implications to be for, say, the bond markets?
Yeah, as you say, Andrew, MiFID I was a huge challenge for the equities market back in 2007, and as many of us remember, it took a number of years before the market participants and the competent authorities adapted to the new requirements. And I would say, and I think Kerstin agrees, that the equities market is now quite able in terms of handling regulatory change compared to 7 or 8 years ago. But still, MiFID II will be a very steep curve to go for the equities market. So it's very easy to understand the challenges meeting the bond market. The bond market is completely new to this massive regulation, and they have to start from more or less scratch. And if I would pick some areas of particular interest, I would pick the transparency regime and the best execution. And if we start with the transparency regime, even if the transparency regime is for bonds is said to be adapted to the nature of the instrument type, I think there's still quite some controversy regarding this regime, especially on the pre-trade side. And as we all know, there will be a pre-trade transparency requirement for liquid bonds. And even if the mechanics of liquidity classification has now been changed from the COFIA, the class approach, to the instrument-by-instrument approach, there's still many concerns that this model will not work in practice. The criticism is that there will be too many false positives, i.e. too many bonds will be classified as liquid. And the most pessimistic view is that the new rules will not work at all, and the liquidity will collapse. Even if one shouldn't expect the most pessimistic view, I think there are still a lot of uncertainties around this classification of bonds. I think this is the biggest challenge of all in MiFID, I think.
For sure. I remember, sorry, I was just about to say that in the equities market under MiFID I, we saw so much fragmentation of liquidity, new MTFs and execution venues. I mean, are we expecting to see that in the bond market?
I would say, Kerstin, you want to go ahead?
No, you go ahead and I'll take it.
I might, there are some indication of that, and if I start with best execution, and best execution is will apply for all asset classes and for venues and O2C. So if you start with equities, it will be a challenge to adapt to new requirements on best execution, but for bonds it will be even more harder, since there is no central order book, there is no benchmark price available, easily available. So if you look at the text, the new requirement is saying that the investment bank should demonstrate the quote fairness of the price, and this is obviously a challenge since a lot of the trading is done by phone and by chat. So I think that if we look at moving forward with the best execution, I think that the electronic part of the chain will increase. Perhaps not in phase one, the trading, but the communication between clients and the investment banks will be more electronic in order to get all the trades. And when we starting to get more electronic content in the whole flow, I think there is a driving force towards more electronic trading. That might take 5 years or 10 years, I don't know, but I think the process has started.
Very good. Kerstin, you were going to say something.
Well, I'm not sure you can copy exactly what happened in the equity, or we will get a copy of what happened in the equities market. The markets are quite different. The products are different. They're traded differently. But certainly for some areas there might be similar activities. And I also would like to remind that we haven't seen the final rules. There will probably, the delegated acts that's coming, that will at some point come from the Commission. We thought it would have come a long time ago. Will I would assume contain a little bit more information on what the rules will look like. So it's important to state that we don't know everything yet.
No, and I agree with Kerstin that I'm not talking about electronic trading. I'm talking about communicating between clients and the investment firm. I think that part will be more electronic, not the trading itself.
Very good. Chris, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's always interested me on the fixed income market how it's changed so dramatically over the years. I mean, if you go back, fixed income was the basis of the London Stock Exchange, and equities trading came later. But even 20 years ago, bonds trading was moving off exchange environments. So when I used to work at Deutsche Börse, for example, we found back in about 1995 that 70% of all the bonds trading of exchange-listed bonds had already moved off exchange. So the market has moved away from an area of transparency where it started to an area that's become very intransparent. And as was found under MiFID I, where in the UK, I think it was the FCA who commissioned the study of, what would it look like in a more transparent bonds market, and the whole market threw its arms up at that, saying that this would kill the bonds market, and the topic was never discussed again, pretty much. We've got massive fragmentation as a natural nature of the fixed income market now, and I think that this is a challenge that the regulators nationally and ESMA are facing, is how do you bring transparency to a market that has no natural centre. In many ways it's like the foreign exchange market. It does have no particular central point, and yet bring transparency without killing off that liquidity. Because people are saying that in the level of transparency that you will need to get the equities market on the MiFID, then that isn't the market that market participants would be happy to take part in the fixed income sector.
Very good.
If I may add there, it's a matter of calibrating liquidity needs and transparency needs. I mean, so the issue is if ESMA and the Commission has found the right calibration. We don't know for sure, but there is a concern, of course.
Very good.
I think as well that there's the element of the retail investor comes in behind this, because there's always the political drivers behind regulation. It's not just regulation to have a well-policed environment. It's also trying to create a market structure that encourages people like retail investors to take part in markets. And in the UK, it's been a very different market to some continental European markets where retail customers don't particularly take a part in the fixed income market. They're very much pointed towards equities, and I think the government's then looking at how they can get more retail involvement in fixed income markets. There will be that natural push to try and create a level of transparency that makes retail investors feel safer, and that push could be a push too far sometimes.
But isn't it also fair to say that there are differences between the countries? So like in Denmark and I think Italy, people have invested in the bond market for a very long time, quite a lot, the retail investors that is. So that market is quite different from if you compare with Sweden, where retail clients are not much involved.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a huge, I think there is a generally huge difference between the EU countries between how this market works. So that is a challenge in itself. The equities
Absolutely.
market have included both retail and large investors for a very long time, and they were MiFID I like starting point, more alike than the bond markets are through the EU.
Okay, let's drill into a couple of some of the elements of MiFID II. Let's start with Krista, and let's move to the next slide, please, which will illustrate Krista's response to this. Krista, what are MiFID II's instrument definition management requirements, and why are they important?
In contrary with MiFID I, I think in MiFID II, the dependence upon parameters and thresholds and such will be extremely important, because it will steer the way you can trade and how you should trade in a number of ways. And I take the example large scale, which is crucial for both pre-trade and post-trade transparency, and also for the client order handling for shares. And the double volume caps makes it even more crucial to keep track of the large scale values. And then we have the parameters for systematic internal rises and pre-trade transparency, such as standard market size specific to the instruments, and so forth. And going forward, definition of liquid instruments is crucial for all asset classes. So I can keep going for an hour or so on all these parameters. What I want to say is that all these parameters need to be incorporated into the execution flow, because it will be impossible for traders and others to make the right decisions having this in their head, so to say, and everything needs to be incorporated into OMSs and smarter routers in order to be able to automate the flow, because we will see a much more fragmented market in MiFID II with large scale dark pools. We have continuous auctions and stuff like that, and systematic internalizers. So it's really, really important to incorporate all these parameters in an automated way into the systems. So I think that many participants are waiting with big interest what ESMA when ESMA is launching this database, and hopefully they will do it soon.
Chris, anything to add to that? You're sort of watching this aspect, I think.
Yeah, I've just come off an ISO call looking at how we start to identify instruments that have to underpin all of this. As I say, I tend to sort of be down at the bottom level of the engine room as to whether we can identify the instrument that sits below the diagram there in the slide, for example, both in terms of derivatives and equities and fixed income. That's a challenge which, definitely the industry is facing. I mean, we now have the initiative from ISO with a study group looking at how we create product identifiers for derivatives, for example. It's also, there's statements that are being made by ESMA about how firms should identify the equities and fixed income and commodities instruments that firms are going to have to report on. I think that there is so much more work to do on that yet. On the study group call that we were just on, we're literally starting now on addressing the issue of how we can meet ESMA's requirements as an industry to identify OTC derivatives, for example. So fortunately, we do have the delay in MiFID, because there would have been no way that we could achieve that by the end of this year.
And how do you think it's looking in terms of the time frame? I mean, is it all doable?
I think it's still tight, personally. I think, I'm not in too much of a panic about it, as it were, because I remember with MiFID I that MiFID I got delayed twice. It got delayed by 12 months and it got delayed by 6 months. So, I don't think we should treat the current delay that's been announced to MiFID II as being exceptional or frightening. And there may even be further delay. I think we've all heard about the national government saying that they also need an extension of time to be able to implement all of these changes within their own regulation when it comes to the directive itself. But I think there is much more there to do than people realise. There have been masses of assumptions that the data's there, available, easy to exchange, easy to report, and ESMA's bringing new strictures into this, new diligence into it, that is going to change the way that firms' core systems operate.
Very good. Kerstin, anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, I just agree to the reference data system that's to be built by ESMA is a key factor in this, and how the success in they are building the system and keeping to the timelines is very, very important. I should also say that so some things we are saying that you should not report, there should not be identified the OTC derivatives, and sometimes you actually have to say also no to things because it's just not doable to do things, and hopefully you could be successful in that. And by the way, for regular local national governments to get more time is already proposed in the Parliament's proposal. So I think that will come, but that will be within the January 2018 time frame. So the final date is not proposed to be changed.
Very good. Okay. Let's move on to direct electronic access. Krista, how will the new definition of direct electronic access affect market participants? What do you foresee?
Yeah, and the new definition of direct electronic access compared to MiFID I is it's covering both DMA and sponsored access. And I think that makes sense because the technology evolution has made the boundaries between DMA and sponsored access very blurry, very thin. And one crucial part of this definition is obviously how the word direct should be interpreted. And in the new definitions, the suggestion is at least that if you're sending an order through a smarter router, it will not be considered as direct. Instead, the SORs will fall under the definition of algorithmic trading instead. So these new rules will affect the participants in two ways. First of all, the investment firms using a smart router would conduct algo trading and thus fall within the definition of algo trading and have to comply with all the MiFID II rules. For example, Article 17 in the directive. And the second effect is that participants using DEA as defined, they need to be authorized as an investment firm and as a consequence fall under the organizational requirements of MiFID II and MiFID. And also implies that the DEA user would become a financial counterparty as defined in EMIR and subject to mandatory clearing. So in both cases, this will lead to a radical increase in requirements, both for the ones needed to be authorized, and also the users of smart routing need to be complied with a long list of requirements hitting the algo trading firms.
Interesting. That's this all brings us on to our next question. I'll throw this one to Chris about best execution. We saw BestEx under MiFID I. Some were perhaps slightly disappointed. How will MiFID II tighten up best execution requirements? And what do we need to do about it? Do we need to build, everyone needs smart order routers? What do we want, Chris?
I think there is something, when you look at the equity side of it, that's changed dramatically since MiFID I came in, where firms have got very effective systems in place for smart order routing. In fact, the more firms you talk to, they find it amazing to think that they operated the way they did pre-MiFID I, where they would just trade on one venue because that was what was most cost efficient for them. I think, though, as we move across the other asset classes that are also affected by MiFID II, that we then see that we've got a situation that firms are still getting ready for that. I think there's a long way to go on that on the other asset classes outside of equities.
Very good. Kerstin, anything to add?
No.
Very good.
It's a big challenge, of course, as always.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We had a panel looking at smart order routing at our conference a couple of weeks ago, and certainly it was one of the hottest topics of the day. We could have kept talking about that for most of the day, and probably will do subsequent webinars around that topic. as things develop. Okay, let's look at some of the impact. Who's going to be affected? Come to you, Kerstin, with the first one of these. Smaller prop shops, proprietary trading outfits. How are they going to be affected by the new regulation?
And this is partly linked to the question about definition of direct electronic access. And if you are a small firm involved in direct electronic access and some kind of market making and towards your own account, I think that the bar will be raised significantly in MiFID II. So in that case, such firm needs to be authorized as an investment firm and comply with all the organizational requirements under MiFID. And also, if you are a market maker, you will also be subject to the algo trading requirements, and a long list of requirements, obviously. And most likely, they will also be under the regulation of high frequency trading. And as everyone knows, that the list of requirements for algo traders and HFT firms is a long list. And going back to MiFID II, I think one of the criticism towards MiFID II is that smaller and medium-sized firms will struggle with a radically increased cost, especially for to be compliant. And this will probably lead to some kind of consolidation, and I think it's very likely that there will be a consolidation amongst these smaller prop shops, so to say, due to the radical increase in requirements.
Very good. Okay. Let's see. Let's talk about internalization of order flow. Stay with you, Peter. How do we expect the new rules to impact firms' ability to internalize order flow, and what are the requirements with respect to real-time monitoring of order flow?
Starting with today's broker crossing networks, that's one way of internalizing the flow, and one of the targets of MiFID II is obviously to move trading away from the OTC space into the regulated space. And if you, for example, are broker crossing network today, you need to either choose to be an MTF or need to be regulated as an SI if you are matching client orders towards your proprietary capital. So I think that will lead to proliferation of systematic internalizers in Europe. And another interesting part of this internalization is obviously today you can internalize and report it using the negotiated trade waiver. And in MiFID II, we will have these double volume caps for dark pool trading and for negotiated trades. And it will be quite interesting for every firm when the caps are hit. In that case, you are not allowed to report trades if they are on the larger scale. So if you are, for example, trading against your own capital to put up with risk prices to the clients, I think you are obliged, you need to set up a systematic internalizer to continue to do this. So this is another reason for, I think that the number of systematic internalizers will increase a lot in Europe. I think we have 11 today, and that number will increase.
Very good. Just to drill down, Kerstin, into your mention of the double volume caps. I mean, what do you think firms are going to have to do with respect to pre-trade transparency and those double volume caps when they're quoting to clients and putting quotes out to market?
First of all, I think getting back to the list of parameters, I think you really need to keep track of what on the operational level you need to have track of what instruments are capped, because that will affect your algos and your ability to report trades. But also on a strategic level, I think firms need already today discuss how they're going to survive, how they're going to handle a market with where 50% of the blue chips are capped. So I think this is one of the most strategic questions you have on the equity side today. How are you going to handle a situation where a lot of stocks are capped? So I think systematic internal analysis is one way to handle it.
Very good. Chris, anything to add on that with respect to that pre-trade transparency?
Not particularly. I think there's one element which is about the systematic internalisation, which has been it's been a basic characteristic of universal banks in countries like Germany, for example, and Switzerland for decades, because client orders, retail orders will come in and will be executed through what's now called their systematic internalisation capability and executed at the exchange price. So everybody was happy about that. Except the exchange, because obviously that cut down the volume of trading that was actually being handled on the exchange itself. I think that the transparency bit though coming up is going to be a much bigger issue now that we're dealing with more asset classes and a larger number of instruments. And I think the volume of data we're going to be talking about is a multiple. It's an order of magnitude greater. So how that impacts systems for the firms as well as for exchanges, and ultimately for ESMA as a consolidator of all of that transparency data is going to make that information system they're building extremely difficult, because effectively it's going to be a superset of all of the European market included in inside one system, bigger than any individual bank. So that's going to be a challenge, I think, when we do look at the ultimate pan-European transparency that all of this is aiming towards. Putting everything through one central system is going to be a massive challenge.
Absolutely. Kerstin?
Yes, I also would add, if you look at the non-equity side, which actually includes also equity derivatives, if you talk about internalization on the non-equity side, you have to become an OTF, or at least you have to consider to become an OTF, because that's the new sort of trading venue kind of a thing. And so that's my only thing to add, because that's the new, that's important not to forget. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Let's talk about post-trade. Chris, I'm going to throw this one at you. How do you think firms are going to look, how do you think they're going to approach the regulations post-trade reporting requirements, transaction reporting?
Well, the ARM regime, which exists in the UK, is obviously going to get spread in principle across the European Economic Area. I've heard that there are some countries that don't want to have the ARM regime, so that will be interesting to see how this works out as a pan-European situation. But the idea of having improved reporting mechanisms, I think it's going to be most important for the individual national regulators themselves. Again, I think it's a lot of this is to do with the volume of data in terms of static, like reference data. It's also the massive volume of real-time data flowing through systems, so the post-trade has to be reported as soon as possible after the trade happens. And when I say the sheer volume there is much, much bigger, I think, than people realise. We've been doing comparisons with some of the network companies about the scale, and this is bigger than the Olympic Games in 2012. In terms of the volumes we're talking about. I think firms preparing for it, it's one of the discussions at the minute is how they're technically going to achieve it, because ESMA has said that it expects all of the post-trade reporting to be done using a new standardized approach that ESMA will be using the ISO 20022 methodology to create a custom protocol. And there are discussions now about, well, if that's how an ARM has to report to ESMA, how do firms actually want to report to the ARMs? Those ARMs will form a critical role, because they will be the gateway between hundreds of firms within a country, perhaps, and a single regulator in a country. So their systems are going to be critical to everybody. And again, how we use technology and standardization will impact the cost of compliance for investment firms significantly.
Could I add a factor there? I think it's very important, or we at least stated to our regulators here, that it's important that they actually, the licenses for these ARM are coming out quite soon, because they need to compete. In order for the cost not to increase tremendously, there needs to be several of these out in the market, and they need to compete with each other. And so not to have one per country or something like that. It wouldn't work.
Sure. And how do you think that's progressing? Have you got any indication of how that's
Well, I
progressing?
mean, it's too early for them to start the process because the rules are not there yet. But
Right.
I hope that when the national, at least I believe they fully understand nowadays the importance of having these new. It's not only the arms; it's also the APAs and so forth. We need to know. The market needs to know pretty soon who will be out there, who will be providing the services, as soon as possible, rather.
I think there's an element here as well. I can understand sort of national protectionism where an individual country might want to have everything done through a local organisation. But I think from the market's point of view, to get that competition, you'll get some organisations developing an ARM capability that could be deployed across the whole of the EU in each individual country. And we may find a situation as there was back in the days of the Investment Services Directive, where a new regulation is adopted, but then you put up barriers after the event to bring concentration back, so that everybody would have to report through a domestic provider such as an exchange. That element of competition there, the role of an exchange as an exchange and an ARM and an APA and an issuer of identifiers for instruments, I think that's one which we all have to look at the governments there, because it's probably not the way that we will be allowed to operate in the commercial world, as banks and investment managers. And I think it's important that the regulators and ESMA look at ensuring the right governance is put in place for all of these situations. There isn't a tendency to assume that surely everything must be working to the best of all possible ways, because otherwise the market would change it. That's not necessarily the case.
No, Chris, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying then there is still one, but we don't know if there will be anyone. The consolidated tape, will there be any provider of the consolidated tape?
Purely as a personal expectation, so I'm not a gambling man, but when I see ESMA developing a data management system for reference data that has to carry a superset combined of all of the reference data for all of the instruments that are admitted to trading across all of Europe, you wouldn't normally do that unless you were going to use it as a basis for a consolidated tape system. So I will not be surprised if ESMA turns around and says, actually, we'd asked the industry to come up with an approach for a European consolidated tape system or systems, and as we threatened, if you don't do it, we'll impose one on you. We may be seeing the foundation of that being built in the reference data system that ESMA is now putting together.
Interesting. I was actually going to ask Chris if the sort of industry response from the commercial players, banks and brokers and so on. Do you expect to see some movement, perhaps in a collaborative way, like we saw under MiFID I? We had things like turquoise and boat for transaction reporting. I mean, are you hearing any noises of that ilk? Because I'm not.
None at all. None at all.
There is actually, as we speak, I saw on the London Stock Exchange website, London Stock Exchange and Deutsche Bank confirm merger talks.
Oh, just now.
13:57.
News. Breaking news. Interrupt this webinar to bring you breaking news today.
As a both commercial companies, I think we should all watch out my shares.
Okay, brilliant.
They say there are detailed discussions over a potential merger.
We have heard that before, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. Thank you for that, Kerstin. Got another questions from the audience. Little detailed question. I'll throw it at you, Chris, because this is a data question. Anyone, please jump in. What do the panel think about the added participant data for transaction reporting? Things like personal data, date of birth, etc. And will this mean investment firms will move away from delegated reporting?
I think that at this stage, ESMA is looking already at what needs to be done at a pan-EU and national level to adjust data privacy regulation, though obviously that will take time as that work is only just really beginning. The problem's been recognised. I think that the initial reaction from firms will not be to move away from outsourcing those kind of capabilities, because I don't think typically the industry moves that quickly, and the industry tends to carry on doing what it already does until something goes seriously wrong. I think it doesn't need to move away from that because we've seen parallels in other financial services sectors such as payments processing and credit cards, where data security standards come in. So it's not necessarily about a law that says what you can and can't do. It's about pure data security standards, about the privacy of information that come in. So hopefully the industry will be looking at what the banks themselves already do in another silo of their operation, so payments and cards, and seeing how that can be used in this particular silo, the financial markets bit, within the same organisation to get the same level of quality of service here in financial markets that everybody expects them to have in retail customers, payments, cards, etc.
Very good. Anyone else on that one? Personal data? Delegated reporting? Okay. All right, let's move on. I just want to remind the audience that we do accept questions. We've got one there using the chat function on the webinar system. So if you do have questions, we probably could squeeze a couple in. In the meantime, let's move ahead. Let's come to you, Krista, and if we could go to the next slide, please. We'll talk about algorithmic trading. Krista, what does MiFID II require of firm using trading algorithms, and how are they dealing with this? There's a lot of talk about tagging, a lot of talk about testing.
Yeah, and everyone has read the text, and the list of requirements on algo trading is long, and the challenges are quite substantial. And we take it from the top. I think just monitoring in real time, that would be a challenge, and we're not talking about transaction by transaction. You have to monitor sequences of transactions in order to detect market abuse or attempted market abuse, and also a new thing that the trader himself, responsible for the algos, together with compliance, need to be able to monitor this in real time. And also, obviously, more technical level, you need to stress test, high volume test, and there has been a discussion if the venues should supply with algo test or not. And then again, a long list of pre-trade controls you have to have in place. With throttling and kill switches, so the list is long, and again, I think this comes back to what we talked about earlier, that the cost will increase a lot, and I think personally that many of the smaller and medium-sized firms today developing their own algos, I think they have to stop with it due to cost and start using white-labeled algos.
Right.
In greater extent.
So that would actually, the impact there, Krista, then is perhaps less choice in the end.
I think so. I think that we are back we're on cost. I think these requirements are good, but the cost again. So I think that it will be a concentration to the bigger firms, I think.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what do you think?
I think that this natural concentration towards larger firms is just an onward progression. We've said that probably somewhere around 80% of equity order flow in Europe is probably managed through 40 firms. So it's not an 80-20 rule. It's 80% of everything is managed by numerical 40 firms. So the ability of smaller firms to carry on where proprietary trading is being squeezed out because of regulation, risk management, where running technology at sort of Formula One type speeds is something where it involves a massive investment, and in a regulated market, that's not just investment in the technology. It's also in the compliance function as well. As I said, for me it's natural. I sort of think of the early days of motor racing where everybody could just take their car out the driveway and drive to the racing circuit and join in a race, whereas now we're down to a very small number of very high-speed companies with very expensive racing cars. We're seeing the same thing, I think, in these sectors as become more and more commoditized, like the equities market is commoditized, and I think we'll see that in other areas as well. I think the exception is that you still get the specialist in areas where automation is less easy to achieve than it is in things like the equity sector.
Yeah, very good. Okay, let's see. Let's move on to some sort of looking forward type questions. I'll come to you, Kerstin, and in your membership, what do you think are the main concerns regarding the remaining process towards that application date in 2018? What are people worrying about?
I mean, first of all, you are worrying about the Level 2 rules, the Delegated Act and the RTSs, that is sort of not coming out. They should have been out a long time ago. And are there surprises there? You can't really start planning entirely until you have them. And then on top of that, there will be Level 3 questions and answers, guidelines. We don't really know what and when will we get them. So that you can't say that you have the level 1 text, but you actually haven't much more, and you need to know the details to know where you are. So that's one step, and then of course we need to have the timetables by the regulators also adjusted in accordance with the changes of the level 1 text. We can't get information on what is liquid bonds in December, like it was stated before. So there is, and then what is there more? Well, I think it's good that we have this 1 year more to really penetrate things. And obviously there will be challenges also happening, like if now Deutsche Bank and LSE merges, that is a huge change, but there will be other, I would assume, business changes that we need to look into.
Absolutely. Chris, in our paper we were talking about the market response, right? We don't know what the market response will bring in new challenges too.
And I agree with Kerstin completely. We need to wait for the delegated acts, and I'm particularly interested in how the level 3 works is going to be. How much local flavor will be allowed in MiFID II. That's really interesting. And on the detail level, we still have major uncertainties around systematic internalizers and for the tick size. Whether tick size will be allowed in the systematic internalizer or not, that will have a huge effect on the market structure. And also unbundling, of course. But hopefully we will get more insight when the delegated acts arrives, hopefully very soon.
Very good. Chris, final words on process concerns going forward?
I think it's planning ahead for volume. I mean, the financial markets business of any firm is a volume-based business, and you're looking for economies of scale in order to drive costs down. So everything is critical around volume. But again, I think that people really aren't aware of the way that volume is increasing in everything they're doing. Clearly the regulation adds an additional load because there's more information needs to be processed, etc. But we are looking at everything going up in that area. We have to remember that MiFID covers pretty much all asset classes, and if I give a parallel, when we were all working on MiFID I, I remember the European Central Bank said that it has to manage securities that are on deposit for something like instruments is what it managed. We know that ESMA is now talking about having to manage 15 million instruments, and that's not across all the asset classes. That volume is going through the roof at the minute. We know that firms in the derivatives market particularly are having to expand their capacity from something like 50%, 55% for next year in terms of their communication capacity. So all of that, as we're looking ahead to a MiFID, is going to impact firms' development, and they have to remember that they can't stand still while the regulation comes in. They're having to move ahead in a competitive market at all times. I think that this is going to be the great challenge for them, sort of carrying on implementing MiFID while the world is continuing to move much, much faster with much greater volume of data to manage than anybody's been perceiving.
Very good. Okay, well, I think we're going to start to wind things down now. Let's move to the next slide, and let me fill you in on some of the resources that we have available from intelligenttradingtechnology.com. The white paper that I've referenced a couple of times today is available for free download on that website. It was co-written by myself and Krista, and we were juggling with the delay in the ESMA technical guidelines, which ended up coming out in September. So that was an interesting challenge, and perhaps indicative of what more's to come in that respect. So please do go and download that paper if you haven't already. We will be running our next Intelligent Trading Summit in New York on May 24th. Interestingly, people in New York are watching MiFID II very closely. I was over there in November where I did a breakfast seminar with Interaction and a few other people here in the European space, talking about the impact of MiFID II on trading in Europe. So there's keen interest there, and I expect MiFID II to appear quite boldly at our Intelligent Trading Summit in New York in May. And as I mentioned, I think we'll be revisiting a lot of the topics we talked about, drilling down perhaps in more depth as we get more detail from the regulators on how things are going to look. So we have a number of webinars coming up. Here's just a few of them. There will be more posted on our site, so please do look at those. And I think that'll wrap things up for today. So if I may, I'd like to thank Kerstin, Chris, and Krista. Thanks for joining today, everybody.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you for inviting us.
Great contribution. I think we really set the stall out as far as MiFID II is concerned. I think we'll have a lot to talk about in the future. So that's all good news. And thanks to our audience for joining us today. It's been a great session. Look forward to the next one. I'll leave it at that. Thank you and goodbye.